Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower, educate, and inspire men in a positive way. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspire Change. I hope everybody's had a good week as much as possible. I hope that you've been able to spend some time enriching your lives, taking care of yourselves, and thinking critically about yourself and the community and world that we live in. It certainly bears reflection at the moment. There's a lot going on, as all of you are very much aware. So let me pick up from the last episode. And as I've been saying, is that this season I really want to focus on the relationship between the individual, and for most parts us as men, our families, community and society in general, and the feedback loop that exists between the two. So I really want us to think about this critically and succinctly. It takes a lot of reflection. Now, why do I want to do that? Well, partly because we're living in a historical time where our way of life, and for most of us in the West, that way of life is actually a democracy, that we live in a culture wherein we as citizens are participating in both the economic but also the political process. Okay? And so the theme that I've brought it down to is what Aristotle asserted, and that is that the quality of our lives also depends in large part on the quality of our society and government. Now, without putting too much or too fine a point to this whole thing, our governments have been, in many respects, sorely lacking. We seem to have people who go into politics because of the individual power and wealth that participating in that system provides them. So you can be essentially, in our case in Australia, a fish shopkeeper, and suddenly find yourself in politics because you've obviously put your hand up to go there and have significantly leveraged your wealth and your benefits as you go along. Benefits that the general population haven't got access to. Now, here's a couple of points before everybody wants to get on my case and go, rah, 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 rah. I have no problem with a fish shop owner, a retailer, or anyone from any part of our society getting into politics. The problem that I have is when they stop representing their constituents and they only serve themselves. That's where I have a problem. Okay, so let me come back to this issue about the quality of our society and the quality of our government. And as you have all picked up by now, I'm focusing fundamentally on two issues at the moment that have an immense bearing on both the quality of society and the quality of our government. So firstly, as you know, I'm always talking about patriarchy as being the underlying fabric of our culture. And it's been going on for, 8 to 10,000 years. It's woven into every aspect. And so naturally, what's the other big influence on us as individuals and on the quality of our life? And that is economics. Now, in the 80s, we shifted our economic model in a very, very radical way, and not for the better. And that economic model is known as the free market economy. Now, interestingly, in both instances, in both patriarchy and in economics, we have been taught ideas that are supposedly reflective of our nature. It's interesting, there's this mirroring going on. So, in patriarchy, essentially, we're talking about men being in charge, and fundamentally, men are strong, and women are not in charge, and essentially, women are weak. And as I've been pointing out, that's not the case. In fact, in many respects, there is absolutely no evidence, no data that really supports this scientifically. Now, interestingly enough, that's true of the whole free market economic model. So, well, hang on a minute, you might go, economics is a science. They have courses at university that teach this. And I go, yep, that's true. We also have courses at university in human sciences and so on that teach things that are not scientifically reinforced. That is to say that, they teach theories about human nature or human being that when we look at it through the cold, hard lens of research, we don't get the data for. Okay, so I'm not going to go into depth at this point in that area. I want to talk about what are some of the overarching ideas where we can begin to really think critically about this stuff that we've bought into, right? And as I keep saying, we've bought into beliefs, stories that really have become theories that drive policies and procedures, right? So the real question that we need to begin to ask ourselves first off is, where do these policies and procedures come from, and what about the outcomes of that? So, taking a step back, policies and procedures generally are driven by theories. And these theories come from beliefs, myths, and stories. And you might be going, oh, he's repeating himself. And that's true, because I want this to really sink in. I really want to consolidate that because, for example, the common issue between, in terms of what's a theory and what's not a theory is we have the fight in many areas of the planet between creationism, which is the biblical representation of how humans came to be, and evolutionary theory. Now, as a scientist, I can tell you there's absolutely no evidence for creationism. Now, I don't care whether the Bible tells you one thing or another, but that's a belief. It is not a scientific theory. So hence, I object deeply and noisily about creationism being taught in schools, especially in secular schools. It's useful insofar it can demonstrate what a theory is not, but it shouldn't have the same import as the theory of evolution, for which we have absolutely stacks of evidence. And no, I am not going to listen or buy into any debates from people who want to argue against that. There is no substantive data and reasoning that can persuade me otherwise. And yes, I'm the first person who says, oh, well, we need to sort of keep an open mind. That door has been shut in my mind between creationism and evolutionary theory, right? So one of the things that then brings up is, well, hold on, how do we think about this in a broader context? Let's take the obvious out of it. Let's just park creationism for a moment and let's take a look at some way of thinking about what we really mean by theories to begin with. And so let's do that. Now, here's the bulletin, right? When we talk in public about theories, most of the time people have something completely different in mind to what a scientist has in mind when we talk about theory. And I'm talking about a scientist practitioner like myself, okay? So basically, in general conversation, theory is often about a guess or a hunch or, an idea, a belief, but I don't have any supporting evidence for any of that, right? Now, for scientists, a theory uh, is a well substantiated explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can incorporate laws, hypotheses, and facts. Okay? So, physics is a good one. So, we have a theory of gravitation, the sort of, Newtonian physics is a great example of that. You know, um, for instance, does a feather fall at the same rate as a brick in a vacuum? Okay, so, really good stuff. Similarly, let me come back to the theory of evolution. It explains why we have such a diversity, although we are working very hard as human beings to shrink that diversity in plants and animals. And how this shows us a network, a web of life, which is revealed through fossil records and also at times within the context of our DNA. So, a scientific theory or a well substantiated theory not only explains known facts, a good theory also gives us the ability to make predictions if the theory is true, right? And also, scientific theories are testable. Now, this brought up a really interesting issue for me way back at the time of the global financial crisis, because I've always been a bit sus about economic theory and about the science of this ideology. Now, if economics was a really good testable theory, there should have been some level of predictability. We should have seen the global financial crisis coming. Well, everyone was really surprised when it hit, which was like, oh, look, suddenly it rains. Well, we've been able to forecast rainfall fairly accurately for a while. So if we couldn't forecast the global financial crisis, there's got to be something wrong with theory then, because a good theory, as we know, is testable and it has predictive qualities to it. If it doesn't, then the theory is refined or rejected. Right? Makes sense, right? Something's wrong with the theory, not what we're observing. So this has a direct bearing of what we're dealing with, what we're living in today. So you'd think after the fiasco of the global financial crisis, people would have gone, hang on a minute, free market economics is not a good theory. We need to re-examine this. But we're making policies and procedures on that theory expecting certain outcomes. And funnily enough, those outcomes don't eventuate. So, for example, if we make tax concessions to large corporations, companies, mega investors, and so on, and they are able to increase their profitability because they haven't got the burden of taxation, then that will trickle down through the community. Now, even blind Freddie, who's got no real education, would have to go, hang on a minute, in my whole life, have I seen that actually happen? Now, people in economics will say, well, we haven't had the free market economy for that long, so you couldn't have seen it. Well, let's go simply on what some people perceive to be human nature, which is greed can overcome altruism. Now, my view is the reality of greed and its fundamental driver is actually patriarchy. Okay, so when I talk about in patriarchy, we're looking at territory, hierarchy, acquisition, and competition. So you want to be top dog. So how are you going to be top dog? Well, you're going to grab as much of the pie as you can possibly can and not share any of it. Right? And we have all sorts of explanations why we wouldn't do that. Like, why would I increase the minimum wage? That would make people simply lazy. They won't work as hard. Or that, if you happen to be unemployed, that's because you haven't really put your nose to the grindstone and worked hard enough. So, one of the stories that are told in this mythology is that those people who are really wealthy are there because they work very, very hard. Right? Well, we know that that's not exactly true. And there's a whole host of these mythologies embedded in both patriarchy and in free market economics. And again, I was listening to Nick Hanauer's podcast with a very interesting guy talking about his book, There's No Free Lunch. And I have just forgotten the guy's name. Tom Burgess, I think it is. Anyway, look it up. As I said, the podcast is Pitchfork Economics, Nick Hanauer. Really good stuff. He really goes into exploding a lot of economic myths, especially around neoliberalism and the free market economy. So I think I've made that now fairly concrete and clear. Now here's the thing, okay? There's good theories and there's bad theories. Okay, we've already talked a little bit about that. The problem is that bad theories, like free market economy or patriarchy, leads to bad policies. And bad policies then lead to bad outcomes, right? Like in free market economy, the deterioration of the middle class, which is fundamentally undermining our quality of life. Why is it that we've got suddenly such a burgeoning problem with mental health issues? Well, people are under stress, and it's not because they're creating their own stress, but because they're living in a system, in a society that is struggling with bad government, with bad policies and bad procedures. And there is no amount of mindfulness, meditation, therapy that is going to necessarily make a major impact on this. It will give us a bit more resilience. I wouldn't be in this if I didn't believe in the power of change, of individual change that is brought about by counselling, therapy and coaching. But ultimately, if you're on the ground with a foot on your neck, it's going to be difficult to get up. You might be able to live a bit longer, but you're not going to be walking around because you've got a foot on your neck. So I hope that's given you some food for reflection. Now, over the next couple of podcasts, I'm going to go a bit more deeply into this because I am very much about helping to make good men great. And great men think critically and reflectively about themselves and the environment they're living in. And we stop participating in myths and mythologies and stories that are detrimental to the overall well-being of ourselves, families, and our culture. And as I said in the last episode, we need to protect democracy. And there's a number of steps in which we can do that. One of which is that we need to deconstruct neoliberalism. It's a bane in our existence. And we also need to begin to isolate and eradicate the power of patriarchs who keep popping up like Putin like Trump and like Boris Johnson. We need to vote them out. Don't give them any power. We need to focus on what, as a community, does really make us strong. On that note, I'm going to finish off. I hope that's been useful and look forward to providing you with another episode of Inspire Change with me. And I'll speak to you in the coming weeks.
Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email miranda@nortainment.com. That's miranda@NOIRTAINMENT.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.